questions during the webinar as it's occurring, but we will be answering questions at the end. So here you can see these are just some quick things on how to use GoToWebinar. First and most importantly, if you would just move any electronic handheld devices away from the computer and speakers, that sometimes causes some interference and feedback, so get your cell phone as far away from the computer as possible. And that we recommend that you close all other applications, especially email or anything that's streaming. Again, if you're having trouble, that might be running interference on your computer. And check the settings in your audio pane if you're experiencing any audio problems. During the presentation, as I was saying before, you can send your questions to us through the chat. We will be enabling, the raise your hand function where you can just click on the hand and then we will see that. We'll see that your hand is raised, and that is when we'll be able to unmute you at the end if you want to ask your question verbally. And if you're calling in over the phone, don't forget to put in your unique audio pin so we can unmute your line in case you want to ask a question. So thank you very much, and with that, I'm going to turn this over to Sarah Geenan for the presentation, Whose Life Is It?
Thank you everyone for joining us on this call. Today, Lori and I are going to be talking about how to support the self-determination and transition of youth with disabilities who are preparing to age out of the child welfare system. I'm going to start by reviewing some general information about the experiences and outcomes of youth with disabilities in foster care, and then Lori is going to share more specific information about the My Life project and our findings, and then we'll open it up for questions, as Chris mentioned. We're also going to ask some polls along the way so that we can hear from you all about what's happening in your part of the country. So to get us started, let's just get grounded in some statistics real quick here. So the number of youth in foster care has almost tripled in the past 25 years, from about 276,000 in 1985 to approximately 800,000 currently in the U.S. Because the number of youth in foster care has gone up over time, so have the number of youth who are aging out of foster care. Currently there's about 20 to 24,000 youth who are emancipated from foster care each year when they reach the age of majority, which ranges by state but is typically around 18. Another 12,000 adolescents run away from their foster care placements each year, and so these are also a group of young people who are essentially living on their own. Statistics also tell us that a large percentage of youth in foster care experience a disability, with the figure varying depending on how you define disability. If we define disability using special ed status, research has confirmed that about 40% of youth in foster care receive special ed services. And if we broaden that definition to include youth who have a DSM-IV diagnosis, that figure grows to about 70 or 80%. Next slide. So how do youth exiting from foster care, including youth with disabilities, fare? I'm guessing that most folks on the line today have heard about or are familiar with two recent large-scale studies that looked at transition outcomes for youth exiting care. The first one I'd like to talk briefly about is the Midwest Evaluation Study, which was conducted out of Chapin Hall, and that looked at outcomes for youth in Wisconsin and Illinois. And that study found that compared to same age peers in the general population, youth in foster care or youth who have exited out of foster care are more likely to experience early parenthood. The study also found that foster youth have experienced substantially lower levels of educational attainment and employment than peers in the general population. One thing I'd like to point out, however, was that the Midwest study did not include youth in foster care who experienced a developmental disability or severe mental illness. So the outcomes for this group of young people who may experience even greater challenges around transition was overlooked. Moving along. Another large-scale study was conducted in the Northwest by Chafee, and they specifically examined the outcomes of youth exiting foster care in Oregon and Washington. And like the Midwest study, they found that youth emancipated from foster care were more likely than peers in the general population to be underemployed. Specifically, they found that household incomes for foster youth were about 35% lower than the general population. This study also revealed that about 1 out of 5 foster care alumni experienced at least one night of homelessness. Perhaps the most striking thing that the Chafee study found was that more than half of foster care alumni experienced significant mental health problems. For example, the rate of PTSD among alumni was nearly 5 times that of the general population and exceeded rates even greater than American War veterans. One thing I'd like to point out with the Chafee study, however, is that they did not include youth with developmental disabilities or major physical disabilities. Moving along. One large-scale study that did look at whether transition outcomes differ for youth with disabilities in foster care was the National Evaluation of Title IV-E independent living programs. This study looked at how young people were doing 2.5 to 4 years after they had been emancipated from foster care. And the study found that almost half, about 47% of youth had an identified disability, and that compared to youth in foster care without a disability, these youth were less likely to be employed, graduate from high school, have social support, or be self-sufficient. Next slide. A more recent study conducted by Smith-Gall at Chapman Hall found that in Chicago schools, only 16% of foster youth who were in special education because of an emotional or behavioral disability ended up graduating, and that among youth who dropped out, a sizable percentage, about 18%, were no longer attending school because they were incarcerated. Next slide. So to briefly summarize, there's a pretty solid body of research out there that have documented, the troubling outcomes for youth exiting foster care. And these findings have raised national concern. And as a result, important legislation has been introduced in an attempt to address some of these poor outcomes. And I wanted to just real briefly review a couple of the most important ones. I'm guessing everyone has heard of the Foster Care Independence Act, or it's also known as the Chafee Act, which essentially doubled the amount of money states get to help youth make that transition from foster care to self-sufficiency by offering training around daily living skills or education or vocational or employment training. And states have a fair amount of flexibility in terms of designing their independent living programs. These funds can also be used to provide housing assistance to older youth. I also wanted to mention educational training vouchers. That program awards grants to current and former foster youth to help pay for college. It's a federal program, but it's administered by each state. And if folks want to know more about ETVs, I recommend that you go to www.statevoucher.org, and you can kind of find out about how that program is administered in your particular state. Another piece of recent legislation that I wanted to mention is the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act. This is a relatively new piece of legislation, and it is important for a number of reasons, but one in particular that I wanted to mention is that it really has some requirements around state foster care agencies focusing on school stability. There's some requirements that state foster care agencies are to coordinate with local educational agencies to ensure that youth stay in the school that they're attending when they're placed into foster care, unless that's not in the child's best interest. And if a young person does experience a change in schools, that there is immediate enrollment and a timely transferring of records. I wanted to mention this legislation also because of the requirements that it introduces around transition planning. Specifically, it puts forth requirements that a personal transition plan be developed for youth who are aging out of care 90 days before they're emancipated. So if folks are interested in knowing more about this piece of legislation, I recommend that you go to www.fosteringconnections.org, which is a website dedicated to supporting the implementation of this new act. And the American Bar Association also has a legal center on foster care and education, which has some materials which talk about the Fostering Connections to Success Act. So while there's some important legislation and programs out there to help youth exiting foster care, in our work we continue to see some significant barriers that impact the transition of all foster youth, but seem to hit youth with disabilities especially hard. And I don't have time to kind of review all the barriers or challenges that are out there, but there's a couple that I just wanted to briefly emphasize. The first is that transition is happening in more than one life domain. So youth are, at the same time that they're exiting the child welfare system, they're oftentimes also exiting high school, and they're actually leaving their home environment, their foster care placement, all at the same time, and they're experiencing this as an abrupt transition rather than a gradual one where youth can, maybe move back and forth between independence and these supports. The other thing that we're seeing in our work as a barrier is an emphasis on safety and protection within child welfare agencies versus independence and autonomy for these young people. So we've heard from foster parents, for example, that we've worked with who are maybe afraid to teach their young person, their foster youth, how to cook or take their own medication because they feel like that might be opening them up to some sort of liability, or it's not really endorsed within the foster care program. And this happens despite the fact that these are young people who are going to be aging out of foster care very soon and are going to have to take on these tasks independently. The other thing that we're seeing as a major challenge or barrier in our work is a lack of connection to caring adults. As probably most folks on the line know, a lot of the key support people in the lives of these youth are paid providers, so caseworkers or foster parents. And when youth age out of the child welfare system, oftentimes these relationships change or end. And so there's not those natural supports available to young people. The other thing I wanted to mention was connection to biofamily, and I think there's really some growing recognition out there that youth need greater support to navigate and in some cases build a relationship with their birth family. We've seen in our own work with youth, oftentimes youth are not allowed to have any contact with their birth family while they're in care, but that connection to the bio family is very much alive in the hearts and minds of that young person. And then once that youth is emancipated, the first thing that that young person does is seek out their bio parent or attempt to reconnect with their birth family. and they take this on without support or guidance. I think this issue of needing to help young people connect with biofamily, perhaps while they're still in care, is actually reflected in the Fostering Connections to Success Act, which I just talked briefly about, where there's actually now funds established for connecting children in foster care with biofamily. The other challenge that I just wanted to mention real quickly is just youth being aware of services and opportunities that might be available to support their transition and life as an adult. What we're finding is that youth are oftentimes not armed with the information that they need to access services. So, for example, youth may not even know about or be aware of the independent living program or ETVs, and that information is typically in the hands of professionals who are making the decisions on whether a youth can benefit from a particular program. And if the youth experiences a disability and the professional has limited expectations based on misperceptions around that youth's disability, these youth may not be referred for programs that they would otherwise be eligible for and find useful. So now we're going to move to a poll, I believe. And given some of the barriers and challenges that I just real briefly mentioned, which these challenges happen both while youth are in care, and then also there's challenges certainly when youth have emancipated from care. And we're interested in just getting everyone's opinion on whether they feel it's better for young people in general to stay in foster care till 21. So we'll just give everyone a few seconds to vote. And I believe the polling results will actually pop up on the screen when they're in.
There we go.
Okay, so it looks like overwhelmingly folks feel like it's best for young people to stay in foster care until 21 years of age. And what's interesting is that with the young people that we have worked with, this is an incredibly contentious issue. We find that young people have really strong feelings about this. Many of the young people that we work with want to be out of foster care ASAP, regardless of what the benefits may be, but then once they're out of care, I think they really recognize and miss the support that they were getting while they were in care. So next I'd like to turn to the My Life project, and this is a study that is funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research. It's part of a portfolio of studies conducted in partnership with the University of Kansas, where we're looking at whether enhanced self-determination results in better adult outcomes. And the My Life study is really the first experimental study of self-determination enhancement or really any transition intervention involving youth in foster care. Next slide. So the goal of the My Life project is to implement an intervention designed to enhance self-determination, the self-determination of youth with disabilities in foster care. And if we are indeed successful in raising the self-determination of youth, we're then looking at whether enhanced self-determination improves transition outcomes for these youth. And we're also investigating whether youth who have gone through our My Life intervention have different outcomes than youth who have participated in a more traditional ILP program. So a little bit about our research design and how we identified youth. So a state foster care program identified all youth in foster care who were within our targeted age range, which was 16 and a half to 17 and a half, really kind of on the cusp of that transition. And so that state foster care agency identified all youth who were in foster care and resided within kind of a targeted location. And then we worked with schools to identify which youth on those lists were in special education. And so that became the master list that we recruited from. Our project enrolled a total of 69 youth in foster care who were in special education. And those youth were randomly assigned to either a control group, which participated in kind of traditional ILP services, or a treatment group, which received the My Life intervention. We enrolled youth in a series of waves over 3 years, and youth were assessed when they entered the project before they were randomized. They were assessed a second time at the end of the intervention period, so a year later. And then we had a 1-year follow-along period where we just tracked youth but were no longer intervening with them. And after that 1-year follow-along period, they were assessed a third time. And our overall attrition rate was a relatively low 13%. Next slide. So a little bit about the My Life intervention. It was based on the Take Charge curriculum, which was developed by Lori Powers, and it focuses on teaching youth a number of skills or intervention elements such as problem solving. The curriculum actually covers 102 different skills or intervention elements, to be exact, and we actually have fidelity measures to track how many of these intervention elements or skills are introduced to youth in our intervention group. And we've got just some figures around our fidelity there. For wave 1, about 90% of our intervention elements were actually introduced to youth, and then that went up across the subsequent waves. The way that we go through the Take Charge curriculum is that youth actually meet one-on-one with a coach who goes through the Take Charge curriculum with youth, and then also helps youth identify their goals for the future and helps them identify the steps for achieving those goals. So it's a relatively intensive program where youth are meeting for 1 year one-on-one with a coach every week. And our average coaching hours for the 1-year intervention was about 50 hours. So youth were engaged in this intervention. Another component of the project was mentoring workshops where we brought together intervention youth and young adults who had successfully transitioned out of foster care to come and speak to the youth about their experiences with transition, or maybe some topics related to life after transition, such as college or career. And here, the average number of workshops that youth attended went up over time. So in our first wave, youth attended just under 3 workshops, 2.82 was the average, and that went up by wave 3 to 3.67 being the average number of workshops that youth participated in. Kind of another key element, of our intervention is youth directing a transition plan meeting that brings together stakeholders, professionals from various agencies that are involved in transition planning. So in terms of that transition planning, we know that within special education there's some requirements around transition planning through IDEA, and now with the Fostering Connections to Success Act, there's also now some requirements around transition planning within foster care. So a focus of our intervention is on that collaborative transition planning. So bringing professionals together so that there's one transition plan that's youth-directed that involves collaboration between the different agencies that are involved in transition planning. And we're going to take a poll now, and just interested in terms of the state of transition planning for youth with disabilities in foster care where you live. So we have transition planning requirements, as I mentioned, for youth in foster care through the Fostering Connections Act, and we also have requirements for transition planning within special education and IDEA, and we're interested in knowing kind of what best describes the state of transition planning for youth where you live. So we'll give folks a minute to respond.
So you have about 70%.
Okay, so transition planning is happening, but it looks like it's not coordinated across agencies, is the predominant response, which is what I would have expected. So a little bit about our data collection. So as I mentioned, youth are assessed when they enter the project, 1 year later at the end of the intervention period, and then a third time after our follow-along period. And the types of information that we're collecting, to start with, we collect demographic information. So we collect information that lets us know or describes the foster care experiences that youth are having. We collect some information on the types of special education services that youth are receiving. We're collecting information that allows us to assess youth's self-determination or level of self-determination, and one measure that we're using to do that is the ARC. We also have the AIR. We're collecting information on educational attainment, how youth are doing in school, and whether they graduate. We have information. We're collecting information on whether youth are engaged in career areas that are important to them. Collecting information on their employment, independent living, quality of life, and we'll stop there because Lori will actually talk more about our data when we present the findings. And before we present the findings, I just wanted to briefly mention or talk a little bit about our control group. So we'll move to the next slide. So our comparison group, all youth that were randomized into the comparison group were referred to their local independent living program, and we actually arranged for every youth to attend the ILP orientation. And then about 77% of youth in the comparison group participated in the independent living program after they had attended the orientation. And among youth who continued to participate in the independent living program, about 42% attended classes and just over half had an ILP case manager. We'll now move to the My Life study and our findings, and Lori will take it from here.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Just to piggyback for 1 second on what Sarah was saying, I would just add that, with regard to the intervention, in contrast to some transition programs that focus on teaching youth a set of skills like money management or how to rent an apartment or how to make a resume, which are all really important things to learn. What this particular intervention does is it focuses more on what we call a kind of set of metacognitive skills, and they fall into 3 buckets. One bucket is skills around achievement, as Sarah mentioned, like problem solving or planning. Another group of skills are around partnership development. How do you negotiate and build connections with supportive adults, those kinds of activities. And then the third area of skill is self-regulation. So how do you getting used to tracking your accomplishments and appreciating the things you take pride in about yourself, and dealing with frustration and discouragement from other people, those kinds of issues. And in line with being a self-determination enhancement approach, what we're really trying to understand is if young people get to work towards goals that they define are important by using those kinds of metacognitive skills I was just discussing, will they be more successful than if they learn kind of more a traditional set of really important activities or kind of key transition content skills. So the study was really focused. I should also say that I'm going to report the results here, but you should keep in mind that this is a pretty small N, pretty small number of youth. We were really excited to be able to do it, and as you'll see, it's going to lead to a larger study, but it's the beginning. It's the beginning of the work here, although very encouraging, because it's often hard to get significant results between groups when you have a really small number of participants. And I wouldn't say it was a pilot study. It was bigger than that, but it wasn't one of a huge national study that that we'll read about in the New York Times. So you always have to keep that in mind in terms of interpreting the results. So the news is that when we looked at how the youth did on the measures that Sarah just overviewed, we found that there were significant differences between the intervention and comparison groups on measures of self-determination, their quality of life, and youth involvement in transition planning. And other noticeable improvements, and I'm going to show you some pictures in a moment, but are around education, the percentage of youth employed, youth perceptions of being prepared for life as an adult, and a trend that we saw towards more stable living for the treatment group or the intervention group. With regard to self-determination, these lines represent the means of the groups from the first point on the left, which is at enrollment into the study. The middle symbols are for immediately after the intervention ended, and then the right side symbols are the follow-up stage. So you can see that the self-determination scores on the ARC self-determination scale were significantly higher, and there was a significant difference between groups as a result of the intervention. Next slide. Likewise, we have a nice drawing here. These are what you want to see if you're a researcher, where you see the groups be pretty close in enrollment, and then you see over time actually a little bit of widening of the distance between the groups, representing the mean differences between the groups. Next slide. Likewise, with transition planning, what we see is that there's significant difference from enrollment to post-intervention, and what we see is that and this is an engagement in transition planning, youth involvement in transition planning, and what we see is that the intervention group maintained across the year of follow-along, and that the comparison group caught up a little bit, not quite to where the intervention group was, but they did show some improvement. Okay, next. So now we're because, as you know, this intervention is pretty youth-directed, and we're focused in particular on youth really learning how to engage adults from a variety of different agencies in planning and helping them plan for their transition. The transition planning that we did was both interagency and youth-directed. We're wondering what your views are about transition planning that's currently happening where you live. So the first option is that transition planning where you live is mostly professionally directed. The second option is the transition planning that's happening where you live is mostly youth directed. And the third option is that transition planning is mostly not happening. So if everybody would record what's happening in your area, we can take a look. So as I think probably we all would expect, we see some hopeful signs here if you're about youth direction, where we've got 15% of the participants on the webinar indicating that it's mostly youth directed, and 13% not happening, and the vast majority are indicating that transition planning is professionally directed, mostly. Thanks. So now to move on to look at a comparison between the intervention and the comparison group with regard to education. And probably there are two things I would point out here. One is that we noticed a trend for more of the comparison group youth to stay in school at follow-up, that there were more of those youth in school. And then the second trend that we see, it's actually a pretty major trend, is that the youth in the treatment or the intervention group were more likely to have completed high school, and that's the graduated row. And I should say that that means that they either got a diploma or they got their GED. And so you can see at follow-up, it's about 72% in the intervention group versus 50% in the comparison group. And interestingly enough, that comparison group number is pretty close to what we see for youth overall, particularly with mental health issues in terms of their rates of exiting successfully, completing high school. So now we have currently working, another picture, and you'll see a fairly major difference here with the groups in enrollment being pretty close, and actually a little bit higher employment, just a drop with the control group at the beginning, and at post-intervention we see the spread between the groups, and then a year post the intervention period we see 44.8% of the intervention youth employed versus 28.1% of the control group youth. Okay. Now this is an interesting finding, and that's prepared for life. So we asked the youth basically, are you prepared for life after high school? And before the intervention we see that the control group said that they were more prepared, and they pretty much stayed level for the 3 time periods. Whereas the intervention group, what we saw is immediately after the intervention, they doubled. They showed a pretty large gain in terms of their perceptions of being prepared. And then we see a year later they actually came down, which what we're guessing means that, you know, in some sense the intervention kind of opened their eyes to the level of kind of both preparation and challenge that they were facing. Okay, next slide. So then finally we gave the youth a chance to just record some of the goals, and the coaches did this as well, some of their achievements and goals in the outcome survey that we did. And this is just an example to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that the young people in the intervention group worked on. So everything from going to summer school to many youth actually really wanted to get their IDs and were able to do that. They checked out different career options. They moved out. They went to college. They finished high school, got their licenses. You can go to the next slide. Can move one more slide. Oh, visiting colleges, jobs, got their GED. Lots of activities that that youth were able to accomplish as a result of the project. And one of the things that's important, as I explained before, we weren't necessarily focusing on skills around, specific skills around doing these activities, but what we found that as students learned, or youth learned how to problem solve and learned how to build connections with adults and learned how to kind of deal with challenging situations or frustration that came up, they were able to apply those and then were able to achieve these goals. So next. So in summary, Sarah and I have thought about kind of really what are the essential ingredients that underlie this intervention and that we think are really important for young people in care to be able to transition successfully. And as you would guess, we think that they need skills that are necessary to achieve success, and we do think these metacognitive skills are important. They need information. They need to know really what their options are and what situations are in order to make informed decisions. They need support and support from adults who are in their lives because they want to be in their lives. It's just critical. And above all, they need opportunities, and that includes some opportunities to take risks and to learn and to then be able to move forward. Kind of key to our approach and what we think is really important is that young people over time learn to believe that the reason they're successful is because they did something, not because other people did it for them, but because they were really able to take charge of their lives. And then ultimately that they're able to achieve goals that they identify as important in their own lives. Next slide. So we have a final poll here, and it's really your opinion when you think about these four ingredients that I just went over. What do you think that youth most miss in your community? The skills to achieve success, information for informed decision making, support to take action, or opportunities to act on their own behalf? If everybody would vote. Okay, so we've got a fairly even split here, but opportunity being opportunities, support, and skills edging out information a bit. Sounds like there's a sense among our participants that maybe youth are getting the information, but they're not able to go to that next step in terms of applying it or getting the support and skill base in order to be successful. That's interesting. Thanks. Go to the next. So what does this mean for traditional models for working with young people? And these, of course, are our opinions, but we believe that it's just really important that we recognize that young people are the change agents in their lives, and this is just a particularly critical truth for young people in care. I mean, they oftentimes are going to need to be the change agents, and there isn't going to be somebody else who's really key in doing it for them. A second implication is that we really need to think about what our professional roles are. You know, our job's really to try to set up opportunities and to do things for youth, or are we really trying to figure out how to give them the opportunities and the skills and the supports in order to move forward, kind of more in a coaching role? A third implication is that, you know, this kind of model is really a model that takes a long-term view. I mean, we believe that the skills that the students learn through this, or the youth learn through this intervention, are skills that they're going to have with them their entire lives. And problem solving when you're 18 is also useful when you're 40, and that we're making long-term investments. The other implication we see is just the important need, which I think we probably all believe in, for organizational collaboration, that we just have lots of different agencies in youth's lives, and we need to work together and put the youth at the center of that. And then finally, that we need to really be focused on real lives and helping youth to really create a future for themselves in their communities and in their families, and however they define that. So we can move forward. The final thing I would share is that we do have some next steps, as I alluded to, with regard to this research. We're happy to say that the Institute for Educational Sciences just funded us to carry out a larger scale intervention study, studying this particular approach with about 200 young people in foster care and special education. And also specifically through Pathways to Positive Futures, the RTC, we have 2 self-determination based studies that are underway that are intervention studies. One is Better Futures that Sarah and I are leading up, which is around helping young people in care be able to prepare and successfully get into post-secondary ed or vocational training. And then the second is Career Visions that Joanne Sowers is heading up, and that's really around evaluating an approach to youth-directed career planning. And then finally, right now we are in our final year of another project called Project Success, and we're looking at self-determination enhancement and how that affects young people's educational outcomes while they're in high school. So we've lots going in this area that we're really excited about.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions that are starting to unfold here, and so I'm going to ask a couple here. In the meantime, you'll notice that the hand-raising function has been set up, so people, if you want to raise your hand, I can see those and unmute you as those questions come in too. So first question is, what was the level of attrition from the intervention group, and differentiating that from the control group?
This is Sarah here, and our level of attrition for the intervention group was identical to that of the control group. So it was 13% across the 2 groups, and relatively equivalent by group.
Okay. And another question is how, any explanation of why the score on the Prepared for Life was lower prior to the intervention in the intervention group?
Sarah here again, and I think that just reflects our relatively small sample size. So we're talking about a relatively small number of youth, and you can always just have a few youth who respond differently, and we think that's what we had for the intervention group, just a few youth that responded differently at time 1.
Okay. And a couple people are asking, how do we get My Life intervention in our area, or possibly get certified to facilitate it?
Well, and this is Lori, and it's a tricky one. We're really in the process of, wanting to make sure that we've got really solid evidence behind it. We are so in this area at least we're kind of continuing to do the research around it. We have provided training to folks in other areas and then some follow-along support, and you can certainly contact us if you're interested in learning more about that.
All right, next question is, what kinds of disabilities did the youth have in the study, and did the disabilities differ between the control and treatment groups?
This is Sarah here, and the predominant disability was emotional or behavioral. So the way that we coded disability was we actually looked at the IEP, the Individualized Education Plan for each youth, and looked to see what the primary eligibility code or category was for that youth receiving special education services. And for about 40% of the youth, it was an emotional or behavioral disability that was the primary eligibility category or disability. And we looked at whether the control group youth and the intervention youth varied by disability status, and we found that there was no significant group difference by disability type.
And I would just chime in to add that one of the things that we thought when we first started this study was that that there might be folks who would think that perhaps young people, in particular those with developmental disabilities, might have a harder time with this kind of intervention, or that if they were they were represented in different numbers in the different groups, that would make it hard for us to interpret the findings. So one of the decisions that Sarah and I made before we started the study was to go ahead and establish what we call blocks, which means that we had an equal number of young people with developmental disabilities that were randomized to each group.
Okay. So I'm going to try to unmute Carol Bergdorf-Lackes. If you're still on the line and have your question, let me know. Okay. Ooh. Carol, are you there? Okay, guess not. So another question we had was, who worked as the coaches with the young people in the treatment group? Were they professionals, and did they have any experience in FC?
Our coaches were heartened by the fact that we had some diversity in our coaches. We had a couple of core coaches who were folks who came from either had education backgrounds or social work backgrounds, and then each year, because we're at a university and we're part of the School of Social Work, we had a nice opportunity to involve social work MSW students who were doing their field placements with us, and each year we had some of our youth assigned to those folks. So our 29 young people in the intervention group, I think were coached by, I'm thinking it was there were 7 different coaches that were involved. So that makes us feel good with having a small sample. It was a bit risky to have a small sample and have lots of different coaches, but it gives us some confidence that that people with different kinds of backgrounds can implement this.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. So one question was, what supervision, curriculum, and training did you provide the weekly coaches?
The coaches meet together once a week for about an hour and a half to kind of to staff and to discuss the young people that they're working with, and then we have a team meeting once a week, but it's really more focused on the research side of things, where we're trying to make sure that the assessments happen and that everybody's oriented and we get consent signed, that kind of thing. But we do take some period of that time to also kind of have team discussions around some of the tougher issues, like we've got a young person who we're trying to find who we've lost track of, and we don't want them to attrit from the study, and so we all put our heads together and devoted quite a bit of time to making sure we could keep in touch with and network with our with all of our young people to keep our attrition low.
Great. And we'll just take one more question so you guys have a chance to wrap up. But this question is, did you examine which of the skills training modules tended to be used or chosen by the youth most frequently or were associated with better outcomes?
That is an amazingly incisive question. We didn't because we were really kind of doing a feasibility study here and getting all our procedures down and making sure that we had fidelity and all of those kinds of things. And now with our next study, we're actually going to be able to, I think, more effectively track the delivery of different kinds of skills, because different young people, depending upon what their goals are and what their personal circumstances are, might work with applying different skills at different times and in different quantities, and so we're going to be tracking that, and then we're going to be attempting to look at how that relates to outcomes that youth in the intervention group have.
Okay, great. Well, sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but I'm going to turn this over again to Sarah Geenan to have a couple parting thoughts.
Yes, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating, and I hope that this encourages folks, creates more dialogue around the need to focus on supporting the transition of youth with disabilities as they exit out of the foster care system. I think that this is a topic that maybe has been neglected or overlooked in the past, and hopefully together we can all kind of create more national attention and awareness to this issue. And I guess I just wanted to emphasize, too, the importance of really, as we've talked about today, kind of putting youth in the center and really supporting their capacities to control and direct their own lives to the greatest extent possible.
So thank you for joining our webinar. You'll see that our website link is at the top of the acknowledgments and funders. You'll be getting an email that has the links to some of this information, which will also include contact information for the principal investigators, Lori Powers and Sarah Geenan. Thank you very much again. Goodbye.